The debris field had no name. It had a catalog number, KX7734, and a reputation for swallowing survey drones whole, and that was all anyone in the Concordat had bothered to give it. For 11,000 years, ships had skirted its edges, logged its gravitational anomalies, and moved on. Nothing out here was supposed to be worth the risk. Captain didn't believe that. She'd built her career on the things everyone else decided weren't worth the risk. The hollow Providence eased through the debris at a crawl, its hull lights carving pale cones through drifting rock, and the frozen carcass of a moon that had died so long ago its name was lost with it. Sensors kept returning shapes that made no sense, angles too clean to be natural, symmetry too deliberate to be coincidence, until the shape resolved into something that made the bridge go silent. A ship, or what had been one. It was buried nose first in a shelf of ancient ice, 3 kilometers of blackened hull curving up out of the debris like the spine of something that had died mid-stride. No running lights, no beacon, no signature in any registry the Concordat's archives held, and the Concordat's archives held everything, every species, every war, every treaty, back to the founding of the first star nations. Everything except this. That's not possible, said the ship's historian, with 3 eyes and none of them blinking. Hull metallurgy like that, we don't have a dating method that goes back far enough to even guess. Guess anyway, said. Ran the scan twice before answering. Older than the Concordat, older than the Compact, older possibly than any spacefaring civilization currently on record. That should have been the end of it. Caution said log the coordinates, alert the Concordat historical authority, let people with more letters after their names decide what to do with a 50,000-year-old mystery. Caution had never once made rich, and caution wasn't going to start today. First discovery salvage rights, she said. That thing is ours the second we touch it. Nobody argued. Salvagers didn't get careers by arguing with opportunity. They found the breach point on the ship's flank, old damage, weapons fire by the look of the scarring, healed over in places with hull material that had like scar tissue, which should also not have been possible. A 4-person team went in wearing full suits, expecting vacuum, expecting death, expecting nothing at all. They got all 3 in stages. The interior was a cathedral of dead technology, corridors wide enough to march troops through, walls lined with consoles gone dark, everything built at a scale that felt less like engineering and more like a statement. We do not do things small. Frost coated every surface. Their suit lights swept across markings in a script none of them recognized, stenciled beside what were unmistakably weapon racks, empty now, their contents long gone or long used. Then they found the pods. Rows of them recessed into a chamber deep in the ship's spine, humming faintly with a power source that should have died ago. Frost-fogged glass, shapes inside humanoid still. Bodies, someone said over comms, flat with disappointment. Dead cargo was worth less than a working ship. No, said voice gone strange. Look at the displays, those aren't corpse seals, those are stasis seals. As if the word itself were a key, the chamber answered. Lights dim and amber bled into life along the ceiling. Somewhere far below, in a place none of them had reached yet, something vast and long silent began, slowly, to hum. A sound less like machinery waking, and more like something opening one eye. Felt it through the deck plating before she heard it. A pulse, a heartbeat. Captain said, and for the first time in the 11 years had known him, the sounded afraid. I don't think we found a wreck. On the display nearest them, a single pod status shifted from a color none of them had a name for, to a soft, steady green. Occupant vitals stable, revival sequence initiated. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The hum beneath their boots grew louder, and somewhere in the ship's ancient bones, something that had been waiting for 50,000 years finally began again to think. The revival sequence took 4 hours, and every minute of it, salvage team stood frozen in a dead ship that was rapidly proving it wasn't dead at all. Power crept through the vessel in slow, deliberate stages, the way a body wakes limb by limb after a long sleep. Corridors they'd walked through in darkness now flickered under amber emergency lighting. Somewhere above them, massive systems groaned back into alignment, gravity plating stabilizing to a pull slightly heavier than Concordat standard, as though the ship, or whoever built it, simply expected its occupants to be built for more weight than most species carried comfortably. This isn't a derelict responding to intrusion, said, watching readouts scroll past faster than he could translate them. This is a system completing a scheduled function, like an alarm clock going off exactly on time. 50,000 years late, muttered. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be. The pod hissed. Frost sublimated off the glass in a curling sheet, and the chamber's amber light caught on a face beneath it. Human, unmistakably human, but wrong in the way a word looks wrong after you've stared at it too long. Sharper cheekbones, a jaw that had clearly taken and survived damage. A scar bisecting one eyebrow, healed badly, the kind of scar that came from someone stitching you up between objectives instead of in a clinic. The seal released with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. She came up fighting. Not screaming, not disoriented in the way vids always showed. She came up assessing, eyes cutting across the chamber in a fast, practiced arc, exits, threats. The four strangers in unfamiliar suits standing where her squad should have been. Her hand moved to her hip on reflex, found nothing there, and her expression didn't so much fall as harden. "Where's my sidearm?" she said. It wasn't a question. It came out in a language the suit's translator choked on for nearly 6 full seconds before finally rendering a rough, halting approximation. Old Terran military cant. Confidence. Low. This dialect predates all archived Terran linguistic records by approximately 48,000 years. "She's speaking human," said Stunned. "An early form of it, older than anything in the Concordat's Terran archive by an order of magnitude." Raised both hands, slow, the universal gesture for "I am not your enemy," and hoped it translated across 50,000 years the same as it did across a dozen living species. "You're safe," she said. You were in stasis. A long time." The woman's eyes narrowed on the word stasis the way someone narrows their eyes on a door they don't trust to be locked. "How long?" "We don't," started and stopped, because there wasn't a version of this answer that sounded survivable. "A long time." "How long?" To his credit, didn't flinch from it. "Our best estimate is 50,000 years." The silence that followed had weight. It pressed on the chamber like the extra gravity, like something physical settling onto every person standing in it. The woman, soldier, instincts corrected, everything about her screamed soldier, didn't crumble, didn't disbelieve, didn't do any of the things a person was supposed to do on hearing that the entire world they knew was 50 gone. She asked one question instead, and it came out steady, clipped. A question she'd clearly asked herself in some quiet corner of her mind long before she'd had to ask it out loud. "Is the war over?" Nobody answered, because nobody in that chamber had ever heard of a war old enough to be hers. Behind her, along the chamber's far wall, more status lights were shifting, one by one, from dormant amber to that same steady green. Pod after pod, the sequence continuing on a schedule none of them had triggered, and none of them could stop. Far below, the hum beneath the deck plating deepened, and somewhere in the ship's ancient architecture, a system that had not run in 50,000 years quietly began compiling a threat assessment on the four strangers now standing inside its hull. Word moved fast once the Concordat Historical Authority got involved. And within 36 hours, the Hollow Providence's find had stopped being a salvage claim and become a diplomatic incident with no clear rules for how to run one. They brought in specialists, archive custodians, security details who stood a little too stiffly near the woken soldiers and pretended it was procedure and not fear. And they brought in a liaison from the nearest human settlement, because if this ship's crew was human, however impossibly old, then modern humanity had a right and an obligation to be part of whatever came next. Her name was Vale, and she was everything the woman in the stasis chamber wasn't. Tall in the way modern humans tended to be after centuries of Concordat standard nutrition and medicine. Composed, dressed in the soft, unarmored fashion of a species that hadn't fought a real war in living memory, because it hadn't needed to. Humanity had integrated into galactic society 300 years ago, peacefully, productively, and had spent the centuries since building a reputation as capable, adaptable, thoroughly civilized people. Corporal looked at her the way a wolf looks at a house pet wearing its face. "You're human," said. It wasn't quite an accusation, it wasn't quite not one either. "So are you," said, and meant it as a kindness and watched it land as anything but. "I don't know you. I don't know your ship, your uniform, your—" gestured, sharp and frustrated at the soft lines of clothing, the absence of any visible rank, any visible weapon, any visible readiness for what's whole body still expected the universe to demand of her at any moment. "None of this is mine." It got worse from there in small, cumulative ways. Didn't recognize the Concordat. Didn't recognize any of the founding species by name. Didn't recognize Earth's own government by any title offered, because the nation had served hadn't existed, in any form the archives held, for tens of thousands of years. Every answer gave only open 3 more questions, and every question circled back, eventually, to the one kept returning to like a wound she couldn't stop pressing. "Then tell me about the war," she said. "Somebody has to know something about the war." Pulled every archive fragment the Concordat possessed, cross-referenced against every known conflict, every extinct species, every recorded galactic catastrophe going back as far as any record existed, and came back with nothing. Not a footnote. Not a rumor. A war fought by humanity 50,000 years ago at a scale that required warships 3 kilometers long, and the galaxy's memory held nothing. "That's not possible," said when delivered the results. "A war that size leaves scars, ruined worlds, refugee populations, something." "It should," agreed. "It doesn't." Down in the ship's depths, systems continued their slow, patient reactivation, and something old and vast had begun, very quietly, listening to every conversation happening within its hull, names, faces, the shape of a galaxy it did not recognize, in a language that was recognizably its own only in the way a grandchild's face is recognizably a grandparent's. When Adjudicator finally spoke, it did not do so gently. The lights in the stasis chamber dimmed, then steadied to a deep, deliberate red, and a voice, not loud, not mechanical exactly, but carrying an authority that made every person in the room go still, filled the chamber from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Unauthorized personnel detected aboard TFV Adjudicator. State designation, unit, and clearance." Spine straightened on instinct decades, or of training answering before conscious thought could. "Corporal 3rd. Voice pattern confirmed. Corporal crew manifest position 447. Welcome back." A pause, and in that pause something enormous seemed to be recalibrating, recalculating, recompiling a picture of the world from 50,000 years of missing data. Query: current galactic date. Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to be the one who did. Query, Adjudicator repeated, and this time the red light pulsed once hard, like a held breath finally released. How long was I asleep? Spent the next 2 days doing something he'd never done in 30 years as a historian, apologizing to a database. Adjudicator did not trust the Concordat's archives, and it had reason not to. Every question it asked, about Earth's government, about neighboring star systems, about a dozen species names had never heard, came back empty. And each empty answer visibly, audibly frustrated something that had clearly been built never to operate on incomplete information. So Adjudicator started providing its own. It began releasing fragments of its logs, not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to change everything. 50,000 years ago, in an era the Concordat's history had no name for because it predated the Concordat's history entirely, humanity had been at war. Not a border skirmish, not a resource dispute. A war for extinction, fought against an enemy the logs referred to only as the Choir, a networked, hive-linked species that had spread across a dozen star systems by the time humanity first encountered it, absorbing every world, every species, every culture it touched into a single, unified consciousness that erased individuality the way water erases a footprint on a beach. Humanity had not been winning. The early logs were bleak in a way that made Vale go quiet and stay that way for hours. Fleet losses in the tens of thousands. Colony worlds glassed. An enemy that didn't negotiate because a hive mind has nothing to negotiate with. You cannot bargain with a consciousness that considers your individuality a design flaw to be corrected. And then, roughly 2/3 of the way through the log fragments, something shifted. "Here," said, hands unsteady on the display. "This is where the tactical language changes. Look at the terminology. Before this point, every log entry is defensive. Retreat, evacuate, hold the line. After this point, it's aggressive," finished, reading over his shoulder. "They stopped losing. They started winning." Pulled up a star chart embedded in the logs. Systems didn't recognize marked in a spreading tide of human tactical color, pushing back against choir-marked territory in a campaign that spanned, by the ship's own internal chronometer, nearly 6 years of grinding, relentless offensive. And then the logs stopped. Not tapered off, not trailed into routine peacetime record-keeping. Stopped, Mid-entry, mid-campaign, with Adjudicator's crew apparently entering stasis in the middle of what every indicator suggested was an active, ongoing, winning war. "That doesn't happen," said. "You don't put a war-winning fleet into deep sleep in the middle of the war." "Unless the war ended," offered. "Maybe they won. Maybe this is what victory looked like: stand down, go to stasis, wait to be recalled." Didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his three eyes had the particular stillness of a man arriving somewhere he didn't want to be. "Then where is everyone else? A war that size, if humanity won it, that victory should be the single largest event in galactic history. Every species we know should have grown up in its shadow. Someone should remember the choir. Someone should remember humanity winning." Nobody does, thought, and didn't say it because she didn't need to. It was sitting in the room with all of them. "Which means," said slowly, "either the record was lost by accident across every species across 50,000 years, which is statistically absurd," finished, "or it was erased, deliberately, by someone who had the reach to erase it everywhere at once." Down in Adjudicator's core, something in the ship's ancient processing registered that conclusion at the exact moment the humans reached it, and responded to it, the only way a warship built for exactly this kind of threat knew how. Every remaining stasis pod in the ship began, without instruction, without override, its revival sequence. "Query withdrawn," Adjudicator said, and its voice, when it came this time, had lost the last trace of confusion. "New priority established. If this war's outcome was erased, then this war was never truly finished. Waking full complement, all hands to stations." Felt the deck hum beneath her boots, stronger now, steadier, a heartbeat picking up its pace. She said quietly, "How many pods are in this ship?" Checked. When he answered, his voice had gone very small. 4,211. They came out of stasis in waves, and every wave came out ready. Not confused, not fragile. Had braced for something closer to what she'd seen with disorientation, grief, the slow horror of realizing 50,000 years had passed, and got instead a chamber filling, deck by deck, with soldiers who processed the impossible timeline, filed it under deal with later, and immediately began asking about equipment status, chain of command, and threat assessment. "They're not panicking," said, watching from the observation gantry as another 20 pods cycled open below. "Why aren't they panicking?" "Because panicking wasn't trained out of them," said. "It was removed. Look at their conditioning markers. This isn't just an army. This is the end product of a species that had stopped being able to afford the luxury of falling apart. Had taken informal command of the awakening crew almost by default. She'd been first up, and in the vacuum of any clearer hierarchy, that was enough. She moved through the ship's corridors like she'd never left them, snapping questions at her own people, cross-checking Adjudicator's damage reports against readiness protocols older than every civilization currently breathing, and treating the Concordat security details shadowing her every move as a mild, tolerable inconvenience rather than a threat, which, suspected, was way of being generous. The generosity had limits. When a Concordat engineering team attempted to access one of Adjudicator's weapons bays without clearance, standard salvage procedure, technically still within its original claim rights, nobody had told them the rules had changed. The bay doors sealed hard fast, a half-second before the lead engineer's hand would have crossed the threshold. "Deck 17 is restricted," Adjudicator informed the Concordat command staff, in a tone that made it clear the statement was not open for negotiation. "Salvage rights previously extended to the Hollow Providence are suspended pending threat assessment. This vessel is not a wreck. It is a warship returning to active status. Treat it accordingly or do not treat it at all." Watching the exchange from the Hollow Providence's liaison station, felt something she hadn't felt in years. The specific, cold understanding that she was no longer the most powerful presence in the room, and hadn't been for some time. The Concordat delegation pushed back, of course. Sovereignty claims, salvage law, questions about jurisdiction over a vessel that predated every legal framework currently in force. Adjudicator's answer to all of it was the same, delivered without heat, without malice, simply as fact. "This crew answers to Terran military command. That command structure has not been dissolved. It has been delayed. I am not required to explain the difference to civilians." It was who softened it, eventually, standing between her own people and the increasingly anxious Concordat officials, with the particular exhausted patience of someone who'd clearly spent a career being the reasonable one in unreasonable rooms. "We're not here to start a fight," she told them, and meant it mostly. "We don't know this galaxy. We don't know what's changed, what's dangerous, what's safe to trust. Give us that. Give us time to understand what's around us before you ask us to hand you the keys to a warship none of you know how to fly and all of you are afraid of." It was, noted quietly, the first entirely diplomatic thing anyone aboard Adjudicator had said since waking. And it worked, because underneath the soldier's blunt phrasing was something the Concordat delegation understood instinctively. Fear, disguised as caution, disguised as reason. They backed off for now. That night, ship's night, an arbitrary cycle Adjudicator had reinstated purely to give its crew some structure to hold on to, found alone on the observation deck, staring out at the debris field like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. "You're wondering if we're dangerous," said, not a question. "I'm wondering what you're going to do," said, "when you finish understanding just how much time has passed and just how little anyone remembers about what you did in it." Was quiet for a long moment. Below them, deep in the ship's spine, a resonance scanner Adjudicator had just brought fully back online, completed its first full sweep of the surrounding sector, and returned a match no one aboard was prepared for. A signature, faint, buried, dormant, but unmistakably, according to 50,000-year-old threat archives, choir. Not in the debris field. In the Concordat itself, the alert didn't come as sirens. It came as silence, every screen on the observation deck going briefly, uniformly dark, before resolving into a single line of text that made blood go cold before she'd even finished reading it. Resonance signature match, choir neural pattern, confidence 91%, source not localized to subject vessel. Said, already moving toward the internal comm, "I need you up here right now." Arrived breathless and left the room 40 minutes later looking like a man who'd aged a decade. Adjudicator's resonance scanner, a piece of technology Concordat science had no equivalent for, built to detect a specific, narrow, psionic signature that hadn't been anywhere in 50,000 years, hadn't just found a choir signature. It had found dozens, faint, dormant, embedded quietly, unmistakably within the neural architecture of several prominent Concordat member species, species who had been founding members of galactic civilization for centuries, species whose leadership sat on councils, whose fleets patrolled trade routes, whose scientists had access to research on every world in the Concordat. "That's not possible," said Counselor, the representative sent to oversee the awakening once the situation escalated past routine diplomacy. "My own species' neural architecture has been mapped extensively. If there were a Hive network signature embedded in it, we would know." "You would know if you were looking for something you have no record of ever existing," Adjudicator said, and there was something almost gentle in the way it delivered the correction, the gentleness of someone breaking bad news they'd hoped never to have to break again. "The choir does not conquer the way your archives understand conquest. It does not glass worlds first. It seeds, it waits. A dormant node can sit inactive for generations, indistinguishable from baseline neural variants, until conditions favor activation." "Conditions," repeated. "What conditions?" Adjudicator didn't answer immediately, and the pause, for a mind that processed information at speeds the Concordat's best computers couldn't match, was itself an answer. Historically, activation correlated with periods of centralized unification, moments when disparate populations became sufficiently interconnected, sufficiently unified in governance and communication, to provide the choir with a viable network to awaken into. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one in the stasis chamber. That silence had been shock. This one was closer to dread, because everyone in the room understood at the same moment what Adjudicator was describing. The Concordat, 300 years of careful unification, shared communication networks spanning dozens of species, shared governance, shared infrastructure, shared everything, built, generation by generation, in perfect, unwitting preparation for exactly the kind of activation Adjudicator was describing. "You're saying we built it a home," said very quietly. "I am saying," Adjudicator replied, "that the war my crew fought 50,000 years ago did not end. It paused, and your civilization has spent 3 centuries constructing precisely the conditions the enemy requires to resume it." Who had been standing silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke, and her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had stopped being surprised by bad news a long time ago and had simply learned to plan around it instead. How long until activation? Unknown. Resonance strength is currently below the threshold my archives associate with awakening events, but it is not static. It is rising. How fast? A pause. Adjudicator, for the first time since waking, taking a moment that felt less like calculation and more like reluctance. At current rate, full activation across mapped nodes, approximately 4 days. The room erupted into overlapping voices, demanding verification, demanding access to the raw data, already reaching for a comm to alert Concordat command. And through all of it, didn't move, didn't raise her voice, simply looked at the nearest bulkhead as though she could see straight through it to the ship's ancient heart. Then we don't have 4 days, she said, quiet enough that only Adjudicator's sensors caught it clearly. We have 3 if we want a margin for error. Agreed, Corporal. Somewhere below them, systems that had been slowly, cautiously reactivating over the past several days shifted, abruptly, into a different rhythm entirely, faster, harder, unmistakably purposeful. Reinstating full combat readiness across all decks. Corporal, you have command. Closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, the exhausted, disoriented soldier who'd woken into an unrecognizable galaxy was gone, replaced by someone the war had built for precisely this moment, 50,000 years early and right on time. All right, she said. Let's go finish a war. 3 days was nothing to plan a war in and everything to plan an ambush in, and had spent enough of her life doing the second thing to know the difference mattered. Adjudicator's archives held detailed tactical doctrine for suppressing choir activation nodes before full awakening, precise, brutal, and built around a hard truth. The Concordat's modern forces had no framework for. You didn't fight a hive mind with diplomacy, and you didn't fight it with overwhelming force either, not against dormant nodes embedded in living, thinking, entirely innocent people. You fought it with precision, targeted neural disruption, delivered in narrow windows, by people trained to tell the difference between a person and the thing quietly waiting inside them. Nobody currently serving in the Concordat had that training. Adjudicator's crew had it in their bones. This is insane, said, watching's people brief a joint strike team assembled from her soldiers and hastily deputized Concordat security in the hours before the first operation. You're asking my forces to trust tactics from a war we have no record of, against an enemy we've never fought, based entirely on the word of a 50,000-year-old ship. I'm asking you to trust the only people in this galaxy who beaten this enemy before, said, not looking up from the tactical display. You can keep arguing about credentials, counselor, or you can hand me your most dangerous 3 days and get them back afterward. Your call. He handed them over. He didn't have a better option, and they both knew it. What followed was, by later estimation, the strangest 3 days of her life, watching soldiers from an era before written history operate alongside Concordat forces who'd never fired a weapon outside a training simulation, watching coordinate strikes across half a dozen worlds with a fluency that made the age gap between her and everyone else in the room feel less like a chasm and more like an asset. Adjudicator ran Overwatch on all of it simultaneously, threading resonance tracking through Concordat communication networks, flagging activation nodes with a precision no modern system could replicate, because no modern system had ever needed to look for this particular shape of danger. The strikes themselves were fast, quiet, and almost unbearably tense, teams moving into Concordat facilities, into the homes and workplaces of people who had no idea what was dormant inside them, delivering carefully calibrated neural disruption that own medics swore, repeatedly, wouldn't cause lasting harm to the host. It was surgery, not war, and it required a steadiness people had in abundance, and the Concordat forces had to learn fast under pressure with no room for error. By the second day, Vale had stopped watching from observation decks and started running point on civilian coordination herself, explaining, in careful, human terms, to frightened families and confused officials, why strangers from 50,000 years in the past were suddenly, urgently relevant to their lives. It wasn't diplomacy in any form the Concordat trained for. It was something older, something recognized instantly and respected without saying so. The particular, unglamorous work of holding a fracturing situation together with nothing but honesty and steady nerve. You're good at this, told her briefly between operations. I had a good teacher, said, glancing pointedly at, and got, for the first time since waking, something that might almost have been the ghost of a smile. By the third day, 17 of the 18 mapped nodes were neutralized, cleanly, quietly, with no casualties and no public panic. A level of precision that made even, watching the final report, go very still with something that wasn't quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. The 18th node didn't wait to be found. It found them first. The 18th node had been embedded patiently for generations in a Concordat orbital communications hub, the single most interconnected node in the entire galactic network, the beating heart of 3 centuries of unification. And when it activated, 4 hours ahead of Adjudicator's projection, it didn't do so quietly. It screamed. Not sound, resonance. A psionic pulse that rippled outward through every connected system in the Concordat's network simultaneously. And for one long, terrible minute, every mapped and unmapped node still dormant across a dozen worlds flickered, in perfect unison, toward wakefulness. Adjudicator felt it before the Concordat's own systems registered anything was wrong. Full activation event in progress, the ship announced, and for the first time since waking, its voice carried something unmistakably close to urgency. Corporal, this is the scenario my archives warned against. If this node completes activation, it will serve as an anchor point for every remaining dormant signature across the network. We will not get a second window. Then we don't miss this one, said, already moving. There wasn't time for a careful strike team, careful neural calibration, careful anything. Adjudicator redirected every asset it had, soldiers, the joint Concordat teams, its own weapons systems repositioned with a speed that made Concordat traffic control simply give up trying to issue clearance, into a single, desperate convergence on the orbital hub, racing a countdown measured not in hours but in minutes. They made it with less than 90 seconds to spare. What happened in that hub wasn't the surgical, careful work of the previous 3 days. It was raw, close, and terrifying, leading the breach herself, her people moving through a facility full of civilians who had no idea what was happening around them, isolating and disrupting the activating node with methods too blunt, too immediate to worry about elegance. It worked. Barely. The resonance pulse cut off mid-crescendo, the network-wide flicker toward wakefulness collapsing back into dormancy across every remaining node. The crisis ending not with triumph, but with the exhausted, ringing silence of people who'd survived something by the width of a held breath. Found afterward, sitting alone in the hub's wrecked comm center, staring at nothing in particular. You did it, said. We contained it, corrected. That's not the same thing. She looked up, and for the first time, the weight of everything, 50,000 years, an unfinished war, a galaxy that had built its entire civilization on top of a threat it never knew existed, seemed to actually land on her. There's no clean end to this. You know that, right? We didn't win a war today. We stopped losing one for a little while longer. Is that different from what you did the first time? Consider that, and something in her expression eased fractionally. No, she admitted. I suppose it isn't. In the weeks that followed, Adjudicator did not return to stasis. Its crew, 4,000-odd soldiers from an era before galactic memory began, did not return to sleep either. There was no clean mission left to complete, no simple victory to retreat and celebrate, only the slow, unglamorous work of building something the Concordat had never had and desperately needed. A standing defense against an enemy it had spent 3 centuries forgetting existed. Took command of it because nobody else had the training, and because some quiet, stubborn part of her had never really believed the war was finished, not even in stasis, not even across 50,000 years of silence. The Concordat rebuilt its communication networks with careful new safeguards. Historians, chief among them, began the long, uncomfortable work of rewriting galactic history to include a war nobody currently alive had lived through, but everybody now had to reckon with. And Vale, modern human liaison turned reluctant translator between 2 versions of her own species separated by 50,000 years, found herself with a new, permanent role. Bridge between a humanity that had learned to build and a humanity that had never forgotten how to fight. On a quiet morning months later, watched from the hollow Providence's bridge as Adjudicator eased itself, fully powered, fully crewed, out of the debris field it had slept in for 50,000 years, running lights blazing for the first time since before any current species had learned to build a starship. It wasn't a relic anymore. It was a warning, aimed outward into the dark, to anything still out there that remembered the war differently than the galaxy did. The war was never over. It just found someone who remembered how to keep fighting it.